Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's installment, the May installment of Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom. I don't know if many of you saw the revised title, but I'm wondering if perhaps some people have joined us to hear about the 150 years of spectrum policy that was in our original Save the Date. After Peter and I chatted, Jen, we thought maybe we might need a little more than 30 minutes to do 150 years, so we cut it back to like the next 15.
Good idea.
Peter,
Good idea.
Rysavy, thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy that you were able to make time for this really important and timely conversation, and we really appreciate you being with us, Peter.
It's a pleasure to be here with you again, Carolyn and Jen.
So, Jen, we all know that there is a lot going on, so I thought we'd start off this session with let's do a sanity check, Peter, in terms of we had the big, beautiful bill. We know NTIA has been tasked with various bands that they are supposed to study. We saw the Department of Commerce and NTIA actually posted some information to their website, creating a new portal where people can go and see the status of those studies and the various obligations they have. But I wanted perhaps for you to share in layman's terms for the rest of us, where exactly are we in terms of spectrum policy and the allocations and licensing?
We are making excellent progress, I believe. The bill provided for up to 800 megahertz of mid-band spectrum. And right now, mid-band spectrum is really the sweet spot for 5G and likely 6G because it provides the best blend of high performance and coverage. There are three bands that are being investigated, 2.7 to 2.9 gigahertz, 3.98 to 4.2, just underneath the altimeter band, and then what's called the upper 4 gigahertz band, which is 4.4 to 4.94, and then at 7 gigahertz from 7.125 to 7.4. There are studies underway for all of these bands. Well, actually, some have started and some planned and will be started soon. So that's all excellent progress. The most immediate one is that 100 megahertz has to be cleared by 2027 or made available for auction. And there's a FCC notice of proposed rulemaking for that, which specifies up to 180 megahertz. So that's the most immediate. And then beyond that, there'll be these other bands. So I think we're in a great position, and a lot of this spectrum is going to be put to extremely good use. Oh, Carolyn, I can't hear you.
There we go. Sorry. I'll apologize to everybody. I'm actually supposed to be on vacation and we're having some issues in the background, so I apologize. My question is, of all of the bands that NTIA is in the process of studying, do you have any thoughts or insights into the relative commercial opportunities that might be available in these different bands, such that one band may be more interest for commercial use sooner rather than later as compared to others? Curious what your thoughts are.
The most immediate band that can be harnessed very readily is that band that is currently in the FCC NPRM, and that's from 3.98 to 4.2 gigahertz, because that is the closest in frequencies to what is currently being used in C-band. So that makes it easiest to deploy for both devices and infrastructure. The higher up you go, the more you're going to depend on new technology. For example, 7 gigahertz looks very appealing because there's a potential for wide channels. Unfortunately, not in the US, where our use of that 7 gigahertz band is somewhat restricted, but in other parts of the world, operators will be able to harness very wide channels. So that could become the 7 gigahertz could become like the 6G band on a global basis. However, it's a much higher frequency than the current C band that we're very comfortable using, and it's going to require new technology, such as what some companies are calling giga-MIMO. And that means antennas with many more antenna elements. For example, right now we're using massive MIMO, which is typically 64 transmit, 64 receive antennas. But to use 7 gigahertz, we may need antennas that have 1,000 antenna elements. So that is on the drawing board. It's all feasible, but it requires new technology.
Any idea what the arc of like how long are we thinking that it might take to actually perfect that new technology needed to make use of that spectrum?
Well, it's operators already, for example, in Japan, there have been some studies. Operators there have done some trials at 7 gigahertz, and they've shown that with at least prototype systems, they can use the existing 3 and 4 gigahertz footprint. So it's within reach. It wasn't that long ago, or maybe I'm just dating myself, when under a gigahertz was considered beachfront spectrum. And everybody was thinking, oh my God, this is the spectrum we need, right? And it wasn't long before we're very comfortable at 3.5 gigahertz. So 7 gigahertz is not completely out of reach. And in fact, we have millimeter wave systems that operators have deployed, are currently using, that are at 28 gigahertz. So that spectrum is totally feasible. I don't know if it's quite ready for mass deployment.
Right, right. Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you in 1 second.
Yeah.
But just to circle back here and just to clarify something for me, by comparison, do we have access to more off-the-shelf type of technology for the 4 as opposed to the 7?
Yeah, I would say that the current NPRM for 3.98 to 4.2 gigahertz, which will provide up to 180 gigahertz, probably a little less than that, that is totally off the shelf. And 4 gigahertz, upper 4 gigahertz, that maybe it's not totally off the shelf, but it's not going to be that difficult. So that band is very desirable from a technology perspective. The studies, though, will show to us, though, what incumbents there are in those bands, what kind of coordination may be required, what will be involved in clearing those bands. We don't yet know what combination of clearing slash coordination slash sharing is going to be required. So other considerations than just frequency are going to come into play.
Exactly. Jen.
Yeah, and so Peter, on that, that was one of my questions. So it's plug and play to a point because you're right. I mean, there things have to be cleared, satellites, similar to the clearinghouse process that the carriers had to go through in the lower C-band. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the other question I would have is, I don't think we've seen it yet, but the rules of if they were to max the 180 megahertz of spectrum out there, do you think there will be rules as to the amount of channels the carriers can get?
Yes, I'm sure, and I would expect, I don't have the details on that, but I would expect it to be similar to what was done in the current C-band
In the
spectrum.
current C-band? Got it.
Because
Okay.
it's really just an extension of that. It really continues from where the current C-band ends right now.
So that would be okay. Got it. And you have carriers like Verizon who bought as much as 200 megahertz in some markets in the lower C-band. It meant, in a very layman's term, is a thicker channel even more than that more efficient for them?
The wider the radio channel, the more efficient it is. Yes, absolutely.
Got it.
We've developed very clever techniques such as carrier aggregation, where we can take a piece of spectrum in one place and combine it with a piece of spectrum somewhere else. And that does work. But if you can provide a contiguous or wider channel, then you achieve much higher efficiencies overall in the network.
And just to push on that a little bit, is there a magic number as to how, like, is it 100 megahertz or once you get to a critical mass of, I don't know what that number is it all the more efficient? Or is it just bigger is always better or wider?
Well, I think one way to look at it is that there's a certain amount of overhead associated with every channel. There's guard bands and then there's protocol overhead. So that amount of overhead stays relatively constant regardless of how wide the band is. So the wider the band is, then percentage-wise, that overhead becomes smaller.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
there's no actual magic number, but I will say that once you have, say, a 100 megahertz channel, that's very desirable. What was hoped for, or what the 6G vision is, that operators might have something like 200 to 400 megahertz per operator. And that's going, just to provide some perspective between the United States and, say, Europe and China, those geographic regions have made upper 6 gigahertz and possibly much of 7 gigahertz available. So they're going to have an opportunity to provide these wider channels for 6G of, say, 200 to 400 megahertz, which will provide extremely high performance. And for us, it's going to be a little more difficult because between the 2.7, 4 gigahertz and 7 gigahertz, we're unlikely to have more than, say, 275 megahertz in each of those bands. So we will make the most of it. We will do the best possible given the spectrum we have. But relative to other parts of the world, it is not as ideal as it could be.
Got it.
Peter, let me ask you this, and it's something you and I have talked about time and time again, which is there a chance that the U.S. becomes a bit of a spectrum island unto itself? And if so, what are the implications for the deployment and innovation that the United States has been at the forefront of and has produced so many benefits for consumers and businesses and the economy? Is all of that impacted if we are out of step with virtually the entire rest of the world?
Yeah, well, we're not going to be completely out of step, but we're not going to be completely harmonized either. So, yes, absolutely. The more harmonized spectrum is, the greater economies of scale you can achieve. If a chipset vendor can develop, radio chipsets that work anywhere in the world, they can make a lot more of them than if they have to do country-specific chipsets. Now, the United States is a big enough market that we can, to some extent, have our own version of the technology, but it's not desirable. It results in higher costs for operators, infrastructure is more expensive, smartphones are more expensive, modems more expensive, everything becomes more expensive, and you're not going to achieve the economic potential of the technology that you might otherwise.
Peter, can I again push on that? Like you have like AT&T who bought 345 and Dish sold or is selling if that closes their 345 and Verizon wasn't there. T-Mobile I think has been on record as saying they're not sure they want 345. When you have one carrier owning, which in this case is AT&T, does that put them at a disadvantage? Is it better to have spectrum that everyone owns?
That would be ideal. Fortunately, 3.45 gigahertz is pretty much in the middle of C-band, so a lot of the equipment that's made for C-band can readily accommodate those
Got it.
frequencies. So I don't see that as any kind of excessive burden.
Got it.
AT&T's already has networks running in 3.45, so the additional spectrum for them is spectrum they can turn on very effectively, very quickly.
Understood. Okay.
So aside from our industry, being so dynamic, Jen, you and I were talking about this the other day. The industry itself just feels very different than it was 10, 15 years ago, not because of the intensity of competition, which has been there since day one, but just the different kinds of players that are now in this space. I think we've all seen the headlines where you now have the LEO systems that are really bulking up, launching many, many, many more satellites. And I think it was just last week, yes, it was last week or 2 weeks ago, we saw the announcements with additional arrangements between the satellite companies and the terrestrial mobile carriers. But then we also saw the mobile carriers getting together and announcing a potential joint venture to figure out an effective way to eliminate rural dead spots and to enhance the continuity and the integration of device-to-device capabilities. My question is, with all of these new, what I would call new players, I mean, they're not new companies, but new players that are more directly involved in this space, I'm just curious what your thoughts are of those developments. I'm assuming it's very exciting, but wondering how you're thinking about all of this movement.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about direct to device. The idea that my cell phone works anywhere is wonderful. I tend to go hiking in very remote places, so if I fall down and hurt myself, being able to text 911 is a great solution. And there are going to be many rural areas where coverage from terrestrial networks is spotty, And so having a satellite connection is a great solution. I think the operators working collaboratively to extend this satellite coverage from their networks is a great development. But we have to keep it in context. I did an analysis last year of broadband solutions, and I looked closely at the number of satellites that Starlink has, for example, looking at one specific network. And at the time, based on a number of assumptions, which I detail in a report that I have on my website, at any one moment in time, at least last year, now it's going to be a little more, the number of satellites above the United States was only 280. Okay. Now, capacity is directly proportional to the number of cell sites you have. Terrestrially, we have, last year we had some 450,000 terrestrial base stations. And compare that with 280 satellites, right? There's just many orders of magnitude difference in the capacity of what you could do with satellite versus with terrestrial network. So the way to think about satellite is that it provides coverage where you don't have good terrestrial coverage. But there's absolutely no way that direct to device can compete with terrestrial networks in any suburban or urban area. And I believe that will remain the case for at least the next decade. And another consideration is indoor coverage. Satellites do not have indoor coverage. So if you're going to use these satellite systems, you pretty much have to be outdoors with line of sight to the satellite.
Peter, and I totally understand that, but if Elon Musk is successful in putting up 1 million birds in the sky, which he said publicly through filings, and probably will get a lot of money through the IPO, which is being talked about every morning on CNBC. Could that statement change? Like if if it goes from, what'd you say, 280 to 1 million?
Well, it would be 1 million around the planet, right?
Right.
So then
True.
you have to consider that the
Yeah.
United States is only 3%
Right.
of land area of the planet. But it's not an even distribution. So there's some amount of mathematics that you have to do to get the number of satellites. I suppose with 1 million satellites, it becomes more competitive, but it's right now the plans are to get for Starlink to something like 40,000 satellites. I think the 1 million was in the context of distributed AI network, not
Right.
direct to device.
Mm-hmm.
So at
Okay.
least, I would say for at least the next 5 years and maybe 10 years, I just don't see the satellite systems having competitive capacity with terrestrial networks.
And if I could explore that, even if they got there with more satellites, et cetera, isn't physics come into play where they would still need, I mean, they might have all the money in the world, but they don't have mid-band spectrum. I mean, I know they're buying some from Dish, but beyond that, is that?
Yeah, so just to be clear, right now, all the comments I made was related to direct to device. That means using your smartphone. That's different than using their broadband service with their dishes, because there they have access to other spectrum, which has much higher bandwidth. So,
Right.
but
Okay.
yes, that is also consideration, which is how much spectrum do they have with these satellites for direct to device? And it's still less than what, even with the additional, I think it's 65 megahertz that SpaceX just bought from EchoStar, the amount of spectrum that Starlink will have is still significantly less than what all the major operators have for their networks. So it's really two factors. It's a number of cell sites versus satellites, and it is also the amount of spectrum that the different entities have.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that? If you take a look at what SpaceX is doing and you look at what Kuiper is doing, they seem to be very much focused on global markets, being companies that provide this connectivity around the world. And I'm wondering, with those two, really engaging in the U.S. market, do you think that potentially will modify, impact, somehow shape this idea that we need to push against becoming isolated? Even though we are a very big market, and perhaps we can have things custom made for us from equipment to chips, et cetera. I would think these two very, very large companies who are looking around the world and trying to harmonize their own operations as they're getting ready for things like WRC, what sort of impact that might have on what's happening here in the United States. And maybe the answer is it won't have any impact. I was just curious what your thoughts are because they are so active.
Yeah, well, they have deep pockets and they're very aggressive, right? So, and they need harmonized spectrum. It's not going to help them very much for direct to device if the frequencies they have in one country have to be different than frequencies in another country. So I don't have any specific information, but it is possible that they could provide a positive force for harmonization, which would be a good thing.
Speaking of which, a lot of chatter, I think, Jen, this has even reached your ears out in Chicago, about WRC, the World Radio Conference coming up in 2027, hosted by China. I'm still curious as to whether or not we're actually going to be allowed to go, but let's just put that aside. What are you hearing, Peter, in terms of the biggest concerns for the U.S. or the biggest challenges we may be facing as we head into those negotiations?
We need to consider that the WRC 27 is going to be held in Shanghai, China, right? And the Chinese obviously want to assert their dominance and their views on the world. So I think it's absolutely critical that the US participate actively to make sure that the agenda doesn't become one that favors other countries than ours. So I think from a strategic point of view, that's absolutely critical. And then the next order of priority would be to make sure that we harmonize our spectrum activities as well as we can with what's happening in other parts of the world. Even though we don't have access to upper 6 gigahertz because that's been made available for unlicensed use, there's still the 7 gigahertz that is going to be extremely important. So we want to make sure that whatever is happening in WRC 27 is consistent with how we want to use that spectrum. There's also some LEO satellite considerations that are going to be addressed in WRC 27, and I think those are going to be important as well.
So, Jen, I was going to jump in unless you want to, just kind of what's happening as we're reading the headlines with AI and all of these other companies that really weren't really focused on our little part of the world 10 to 15 years ago. And here I'm thinking of folks like NVIDIA and others who are kind of looking at our world from an AI perspective and compute power and what can they leverage potentially from the investment that the mobile network operators have been making in their networks. And I'm just curious, really, Peter, thoughts on what you're seeing out there in the headlines in terms of the different approaches some of these companies have. I think NVIDIA, for example, was suggesting that they feel all of the base stations in the United States should host, one of their GPUs at the bottom of the base station. I don't know that that's a universally held idea. I think some companies might have different ideas about how they want to architect their networks, but curious what you think of the conversation that's growing out there. Where do you think it goes from here? Implications for the mobile network operators? It's actually 3 questions, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Well, you can't have a webinar without discussing AI, right? But AI is going to be absolutely crucial for 5G and especially 6G. And I see AI being integrated into every layer of the protocol stack. It's going to be at the physical layer because the radio environment is becoming so complex. So handling that with AI assistance is going to make a huge difference. And then all the way up to the application layer where users are doing all their AI-based applications. NVIDIA's view that the wireless network could just become a huge distributed AI network using their chips. It sounds good. Basically have a huge AI network and then just attach antennas to it, right? And we're done. But it's not realistic, I don't think, because operators need to have control over their networks. Whether an NVIDIA solution is the best for them or not, remains to be seen. I think every operator has to make their own decisions. There's also this notion that you really need to run the AI applications at the network because you achieve extremely low latency. So you can imagine if you're controlling, robots in real time, that you need that control extremely close to where these devices are operating. But our AI networks are already becoming so distributed. There's already so much AI infrastructure that if you move the AI, at least, the network-based AI, closer to the network, closer to the radio, you're only going to achieve a few milliseconds gain in latency. And I just can't see right now enough applications to warrant that. So I'm a little skeptical. I'm a big believer that AI is going to be throughout these networks, but whether it's going to be based on NVIDIA solutions or not really remains to be seen. But there is one crucial point I want to make, though, which is that given NVIDIA's huge interest in this, I think that demonstrates just how important AI is going to be for these wide area broadband networks. And I really think that's the main takeaway.
That's a really good
Peter,
point, Peter.
do you think that AI traffic, CTIA had a recent study out that I think AI traffic now on wireless networks is less than 5%, but growing quickly. And I'm just trying to kind of square the circle or whatever the expression is. Like if I'm doing AI, I'm not doing Instagram or, isn't it just a pie? I mean, if I understand if the glasses take off and things like that, that's incremental. But how do you see that?
Well, I see that AI is going to unleash a lot of new types of applications. It's very hard to predict exactly which ones are going to be huge. I feel like it's like the beginning of mobile broadband with, when LTE first became available, nobody at that point could really see like a Google Maps solution or
Sure.
Uber and so forth, right? So I think a lot of innovation is going to emerge from this, but it's not that hard to see that a lot of these potential applications are going to require a lot of information in the environment to be uploaded into the network to be processed in real time. So I think you can make a very good case that uplink traffic could increase dramatically thanks to AI. And people are saying that. It remains to be seen if that's true or not, but I have some reasonable confidence that that will occur.
So, Peter, I think one of the things you do so well is you are spotting trends out there. You were talking about massive MIMO, I think 12, 13 years ago. And when we would repeat it or cite to you, people thought we were nuts. Like, what are you talking about? What is that? So I wanted to bring your vision forward here and ask you to, and I don't think there's any right or wrong answer here because it's all greenfield. What do you think a vision is for 6G? I feel like we're no longer doing the step changes between 1G, 2G, 3G, right? This is something entirely different in terms of the expected experience potentially, but just based on the capabilities that are now going into these networks, even and then you adding on the AI, functionality, et cetera. How do we think about what we're going to be facing over the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think?
Sure. Well, 6G is going to be a combination of incremental improvements and major new functionality. So some of the incremental improvements are to just make more efficient use of the current radio bands. So we already are using a lot of spectrum, midband and so forth, low band, and there are innovations planned for 6G that will give us something like a 30-50% gain in efficiency to get more capacity out of what we already have. 6G, well, let me just back up and say, I don't think operators really want to rip out everything they have in 5G and replace it with 6G, right? That's
I,
not
I,
really
I
that's
agree
not
with
really
you.
on the
I don't
drawing
think so.
boards. So a lot of the emphasis in 6G is to leverage as much as possible what we already have, right? 6G will increase the number of frequencies we can access. There is considerations of using sub-terahertz frequencies. That means going, for example, up to 300 gigahertz. That will give us yet more capacity, but it's going to be much more localized. How important that is, I'm not sure. But the general outcome is that the 6G networks are going to have, should have at least 10 times the capacity of what we have with 5G. And then combined with AI developments, I think it really is going to open up significantly the number of applications that are going to be available to developers. I really do see that in the next 10 years, the way we're using these networks is going to fundamentally change. I think there's going to be wearables, going to be implanted devices. We're going to see a lot more devices, modems, and sensors, and so forth in the environment. Another huge innovation for 6G is something called sensing, being able to use the radio to be able to sense devices or sense what's inside the environment through walls and so forth. That opens up a whole nother category of applications. So I'm basically very excited about all the possibilities. I can't tell you which company you should invest in, though.
And maybe this is my last question, but circling where we started. If you see greater efficiency in that spectrum, does that decrease carriers' need for spectrum? Or if they say what we have is going to increase it, when we get to 6G, it'll be 40% more efficient. Or is your thought that just the huge traffic from these unknown applications will just offset it?
The data growth has always required a combination of making the radio technology more efficient. So that has been the case all the way from 1G and now through to 6G. So that has always occurred in each generation of technology. The other way of increasing capacity has been to increase the number of cell sites, and we've been doing that progressively. We've seen the number of macro base stations increase at a steady rate, and we're going to see more and more small cells being deployed. So that increases capacity, but those two alone are not enough. We've always needed additional spectrum to address the growth in data.
Carolyn, you're muted.
Last question. We're about out of time. Spectrum sharing. We would be remiss, in addition to not, if we were to do a webinar and not talk about AI, but we, of course, have to talk about spectrum and sharing. A lot of discussion about dynamic spectrum sharing about a year or 2 years ago. Haven't heard too much about it. I know that there are some advocates for certain companies that would argue that CBRS is the nirvana for sharing. Obviously, we've had that discussion, Peter. You've documented it in detail, that it's not the nirvana that folks are making it out to be. So my question is, are you aware of any advances happening in terms of efforts to figure out how we actually do dynamic spectrum sharing?
Yeah, dynamic spectrum sharing is interesting because we've been trying to solve this problem forever, and we have yet to come up with a general purpose solution. And there just is none, because anytime you share between two systems, the two systems are different, and you have to come up with a solution that addresses the specific requirements of those. Even CBRS, which supposedly is a general purpose solution, isn't, because it's based on coexistence of commercial networks with Navy radar systems. But there is research experimentation going on behind the scenes that I'm aware of, and there are promising approaches being developed that would be, I think, a much more efficient solution than CBRS. So I can't really discuss the detail of those, but they are in the works. There are demonstrations planned. And I think the way to think about it is that we really need a toolbox for coexistence, coordination, sharing when clearing is not feasible. So CBRS has a database, maybe we can use a database, but CBRS also requires a separate sensing network to sense when Navy radar is working. Well, a more efficient solution is for the radio network itself to do the sharing. The sensing. Another specific point is that with CBRS, it's a brute force solution. If the sensing network detects radar, it instructs the database to inform the commercial networks just to stop using those channels entirely. So that works, but it's brute force. A much more efficient way would be for the radio network to say, hey, an incumbent is operating in this area. I'm just going to make sure I don't direct radio energy with my smart antennas in that direction, and I'm going to keep using those frequencies in other directions. So there are much better ways of sharing if we have to share than CBRS.
As always, incredibly eloquent, Peter. Thank you very, very, very much. Jen, any last questions for our guest, even though I just asked him the last question?
No, Peter, you were great. I mean, like always, I have, a million follow-up questions and great copious notes from this 32-minute discussion. So thank you.
Thank you both. I enjoyed the discussion.
Peter, thank you again. Really, we look forward to seeing you as our guest in the future. And until then, enjoy your hiking and your use of your D2D capabilities.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Thank you.
Jen,
Happy
as always,
summer.
talk to you
Okay,
soon.
take care. Bye. Thanks, Peter.
Bye.